and kick us off. All right, so first off, welcome. On behalf of our entire LISC Safety and Justice team, including our Vice President for Safety, Mona Manga, fellow TTA leads for this project, Matt Perkins and LeVar Michael. My name is James Stark, and I am super thrilled to welcome you to this webinar focusing on an issue that you all have identified as a priority, creating a trauma-informed school community. We're also joined by our funders, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, including Leonora Fleming and Alex Serrano. This webinar was going to be 90 minutes. We can flip to the next slide. We'll just do the orientation real quick. Oh gosh, before I forget, I have to do the acknowledgement and disclaimer. So as always, this project is supported by our friends at OJJDP. So the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of us, LISC, and Family Services of Rhode Island, and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Thank you, Kayla. All right. So this webinar is going to be 90 minutes. And as you can see the run of show on this slide, which will include time for your questions. Next slide. Moving to the goals of this grant program and today's webinar. For the program overall, we want to see our CYVP resources utilized to reduce the incidence of school violence through accountability efforts for offenders, respond to victimization, exposure to violence and trauma as a result of violence that occurs in the school, community, or family, improve school safety and climate, and prevent the violence, delinquency, and victimization in your designated community. Throughout our work with your sites, we've heard consistently during these conversations that the goals of this program cannot be fully achieved without creating a more trauma-informed, and I'd also include trauma-responsive school community. This includes working with school administrators, staff, and community partners to identify common symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, how secondary traumatic stress impacts organizational systems and communities, and how to mitigate the impact of secondary stress on the workforce, and the common traits of an effective community-based partnership and how these partnerships can be created or enhanced to respond to organizational stress. So we're super glad to bring to you two amazing women that have been doing this work in the field and with schools for years. Thank you for switching. First, we have Sarah Kelly Palmer. Sarah is a licensed independent clinical social worker and vice president of the healing department at the Family Services of Rhode Island. Sarah oversees all behavioral health and victim services at FSRI, including the Office and community-based trauma-focused clinical treatment for youth, children, and families, and the Police Go-To team, which partners with 5 law enforcement agencies throughout the state of Rhode Island to respond to victims and witnesses of crime. Sarah specializes in trauma-informed care in mental health and child welfare systems. She has been trained in a number of trauma-informed evidence-based practices, such as child-parent psychotherapy, alternatives for family cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma systems therapy, and is a trauma-focused CBT therapist and supervisor. Sarah is also a trainer at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network on the topics of child welfare trauma, on the Child Welfare Trauma Training Toolkit and the Resource Parent Curriculum. I told Sarah I was going to screw that up, and I sure did. Sarah provides training and consultation in trauma-informed treatment and practices in mental health and child welfare settings, and presents nationally on the subject of trauma-informed practice. Sarah has been a project director or principal investigator on several federal grants related to trauma-informed practice, and is an adjunct faculty member at Fordham University, where she teaches classes in child and adolescent trauma. And next we have Kayla David. Kayla is a licensed marriage and family therapist and clinical director of trauma, loss, and victim services at Family Services of Rhode Island. Ms. David offers treatment for trauma-exposed children and their families and clinical supervision for a team of clinicians. She oversees the Trauma Training Institute at FSRI, providing training and consultation to mental health professionals, practitioners, educators, and community members about the impact of trauma across the lifespan and the development of trauma-informed systems. She is a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the co-chair of its Sexual Health Committee. Kayla is also the chair of the LGBTQI Interagency Committee in Rhode Island, which looks to ensure equitable treatment of LGBTQI youth in the child welfare system. Ms. David has worked with several school departments and child serving systems to provide training and consultation on the development of trauma responsive child serving systems, and has presented nationally on the creating of statewide trauma informed and responsive systems of care and on working with LGBTQI families. Sarah and Kayla, thank you so much.
Thanks,
And
James.
that was a lot, I know, but you guys are experts and we're glad to bring you to this group. So the floor is yours, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, everyone. We're so excited to be here. And as James said, we will have time for questions at the end. So please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. One of the big things that I wanted to start with is that this is just the tip of the iceberg when we're talking about trauma responsive systems, when we're talking about workforce resilience, when we're talking about intentional partnering. So we will talk about each one of those topics today, but there's so much more and we could talk for days about it, which is my biggest struggle, is getting this into an hour-and-a-half presentation. So we will be available as with LISC as consultants. So if there are things that you and your site are looking for, please don't hesitate to reach out to James or to us, and we can kind of talk more about any of these subjects. But lots of exciting things to get to today. We did want to kind of center ourselves on what trauma is. I believe that many of you are already kind of on your journeys of doing trauma-informed or responsive school-wide initiatives. So we won't spend a ton of time on trauma today. Instead, we'll be talking more about secondary traumatic stress and workforce and partnering. But we did want to kind of start off making sure that we were all on the same page. So when we think about trauma, we can often think about kind of situations. So we can think about children who are experiencing abuse at home, have witnessed domestic violence, have experienced sexual abuse. But there are so many experiences that can be potentially traumatic to individuals. And it really is about their perception and kind of the impact of those events. So when we're thinking about trauma, it's in fact more helpful to be thinking about internal and external resources that an individual has to cope with stress. Throughout our lifetimes, many of us, or almost all of us, will be exposed to potentially traumatic events that are just so outside of the norm of our everyday life. And for most, we experience those events and we have internal and external resources. So that can be internal, can be temperament, it can be kind of our personality, our outlook, our meaning making, our feelings of mastery over certain things that we enjoy, our hobbies, our past mental health experience, our past trauma experience. And then we have external resources, which are our schools, they are our family structure, they're the stress that's in our family, they're the communities, they're the supportive people we have, they're the kind of hobbies and interests we have outside of ourselves in our day-to-day life. And what often happens for people is we have both of those, we have external and internal resources, and when a disturbing thing happens, when something potentially traumatic happens, we see short-term symptoms or impact in people's functioning. That usually lasts about 30 days and can be anywhere from mild symptoms like sleep disturbance or appetite disturbance to changes in the way we're thinking about ourselves, others, in the world. But oftentimes between the internal resources we have and the systems around us, the supportive environments, we can usually cope with that experience and get back to kind of pre-exposure kind of functioning. So for most people, we can have about 30 days of symptoms if we think about having a fender bender. When we leave this webinar and we get into our cars later today and we get into a car crash, we might have some short-term symptoms from that, especially if it's not a severe incident. But for some, because of the things that are going on in our lives and our experience, maybe our past experiences, that might overwhelm our ability to cope. And then we'll see things that we'll talk about in a second, which is longer term symptoms. And so we can see that in our students, we can see that in our staff, and over time we can see trauma overcoming or the both internal and external resources we have in our communities and in our organizations.
When we think about trauma, we often get the question about, what is the difference between stress, because we all experience stress in our daily lives, and trauma. And we like to think about and approach this idea of stress in these kind of degrees, right? And when we think about stress, not all stress can be negative or is bad, right? We have positive stress in our lives, right? So an example of positive stress might be, let's see, a student about to take a math test, right? And they're feeling nervous about it. So their heart rate might increase. They might be really focused in on this math test is about to happen. And, their brain and their body is kind of really preparing them for this, this event, right? And that positive stress can actually help us in our lives when we're preparing for something like a math test, let's say. Then we have this other degree of stress, which we like to think as is more tolerable. So that's when a serious thing might happen. For example, the loss of a loved one, maybe, a major life event like a divorce. So that's a serious thing that can be impacting us. And our stress response happens. But we have things, Kayla mentioned this briefly, in our lives that can mitigate that stress response. So those internal and external factors that can help to buffer in a positive way that tolerable stress. So we might lose a loved one and feel grief about that. And that grief might last some time, but we're able to grieve and move on and be able to still engage in our work lives, our personal lives. When we think about the next degree of stress, which we call toxic stress, that really is when there can be a tipping point where toxic stress really refers to an ongoing, intense exposure to an event or events that activate our stress response system. And we don't have the either internal or external capacity to deal with that ongoing stress. So an example of toxic stress might be a child who is exposed to ongoing domestic violence, or a school environment, let's say, that is on high alert at all times because of the level of violence that's happening. Toxic stress really is that tipping point where stress can become potentially traumatic. And we are kind of grounding you in all this because, as you'll see, hopefully from our presentation, schools really, if they're in a healthy, trauma-informed place, can really help to mitigate the impact of toxic stress on not only the students in the schools, but also for each other as staff members in that school.
So to kind of talk a little bit about those common effects. So as Sarah was saying, when we're experiencing something that moves into tolerable or toxic stress, we are going to see that impacting a child's mood, behavior, and functioning. Same with adults. If we are experiencing a toxic level of stress, we will begin to see symptoms not only in our mental health, but in our physical health as well, and our ability to navigate life stressors, changes, relationships. So one of the most common things we can see is sleep and appetite disturbance. It is usually the thing that happens, the symptom that is the earliest to onset. So we can see it happening almost immediately, and it causes potentially the most stress, and kind of has a kind of snowball effect. If we're not sleeping, then we're going to be more irritable. We're going to see emotional detachment. We're going to see increases in mental health issues. So when we see that we're not getting those basic needs met, when we're not eating and we're not able to sleep, we see that it really snowballs into some other common symptoms. So we can see for younger kids, elimination problems or some regressive behaviors. We can see really high activity levels and irritability, acting out, impulsivity. And oftentimes what we know, or what we see when it comes to kind of kids being referred into treatment, is that they've already been diagnosed with ADHD because they have a set of symptoms that looks really, really similar. And yet what we find is that the child has in fact had a trauma exposure. They're having other symptoms of trauma exposure, and that actually can be causing some of the symptoms that maybe we're just seeing a set of the symptoms with ADHD, where there really is all of these other symptoms that began after that exposure. And so we can see that many kids come in with ADHD, but in fact are experiencing something like PTSD or toxic stress. We can also see those children who are really detached. And so much of our kind of systems are focused on the kids that are really behavioral. They're loud, right? They are knocking over chairs, they're getting into fights. We know that they're having a hard time. When we have schools where there's lots of violence and there's lots of kind of behaviors present for those students, we often miss the kids that are emotionally detached, that have no connection, that don't make eye contact, that don't raise their hand, that are distant or numb, because we're focused on the ones that are making the noise, right, or disturbing the classroom. And so it can be really easy for kids that are emotionally detached to go unconnected to. Oftentimes, those are the kids that do not get treatment. They're not seen at a tier 3 level of MTSS to consider individual treatment, but in fact might be experiencing a pretty complex set of trauma symptoms. We can also see hypervigilance. So again, that feeling that the child is on high alert. And this comes from an experience of feeling like the world is not a safe place and other people can't be trusted. So always worrying about the experiences they're going to have, something bad is going to happen again. And this is something we see really commonly for teachers who are experiencing, or child welfare workers, or police officers, or therapists who are working with children who've experienced trauma, is they themselves begin to internalize that feeling that the world isn't safe. And they themselves begin to have pretty significant symptoms of hypervigilance. On top of that, we can see increases in mental health issues. We can see children replaying the trauma. So it's usually on one end or the other. We have kids that are totally avoidant. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to be near people, places, or things that reminded them of what happened. And then we can have children that are ruminating. They can't stop thinking about what happened to them. And so they are drawing it, they are sharing it, they're potentially sharing that with other students. And especially this happens with younger kids, where they cannot stop talking about or drawing about the trauma. And that, begins to expose the other children to trauma stories. For adults and children, we see poor boundaries, especially around relationships with others. And when we're looking at youth, we see that play out in relationship dynamics, whether with friends or in romantic relationships or sexual relationships, where they don't have a sense of boundaries, and that comes from experiencing violation to themselves. And it comes from experiencing non-consent. And especially when we've had a parent that is part of that trauma, can often be very confusing in terms of kind of the safety or the trustworthiness of other people. And one of the important things to remember as we're looking at this list is that no two children are going to show the effects of trauma in the same way. So everyone is going to kind of show up differently, and they'll have a mix of these symptoms. They might have different symptoms. No two children are going to have the same set of symptoms that you see, and the same way of kind of processing what has happened to them or making meaning of what has happened to them.
So as Kayla just said, right? So trauma is really individual. So no one person is going to experience it in the same way. We just wanted to share and kind of ground you all in this, the definition of traumatic stress and trauma we like to refer to was developed by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, right? So this idea that individual trauma results from an event, or it could be a series of events or circumstances that's experienced by an individual as either physically and or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And that event or events has an ongoing, lasting adverse impact on that individual, really potentially in all domains of that functioning. And when we as helpers or educators work with students or individuals who've experienced trauma, and if we do that in an open and engaged and empathetic way, the likelihood of us being then in turn impacted by that trauma that we're hearing about is pretty high when you think about it. And you don't even necessarily need to know the specific details of the trauma that's happened. Just knowing that your student or youth that you're working with has gone through something like physical abuse, let's say, can be enough to really impact you. So while working with trauma, children impacted by trauma or trauma survivors can be very meaningful, it can also be very difficult for the helper, right? For the educator, the therapist. And what we end up seeing is there can be this real ripple effect, right? So that the more that you're exposed to working with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, the more that it can impact you yourself, right? And you can become exposed to or start to experience something we call secondary traumatic stress. And that's really when all those symptoms Kayla just kind of reviewed with us that can happen as a result of an exposure to trauma can actually happen to us as the helper. So we don't necessarily have to experience a trauma directly ourselves, but being exposed to the stories and the experiences of our students or individuals we're helping can actually have us experience those same symptoms. And that can start to impact not only our professional lives, but our personal lives as well. And if you think, and we're going to talk about COVID-19 a little bit here further on in our presentation, but we really have are still experiencing this collective trauma that is COVID-19, which has impacted our mental health and so many things in not only our lives, but our students' lives, that you could really see where it could make it harder for us as helpers and educators to kind of be present and be there in a way that can best help to mitigate the traumatic stress that our students are going through. So what we're hoping to really impart to you all today is that it is just as important to pay attention to our own secondary traumatic stress and the impact on staff and teachers and schools as a whole, as it is to tend to the students who are experiencing traumatic stress, because it is all connected.
Well, Sarah, what you're saying reminds me of a teacher I was working with at the very beginning of the pandemic, when we still had teachers working from home, and I was doing a lot of group and individual treatment with teachers in a particular school district at the time. And I was talking to a teacher on the phone after a group session, and they had shared with me that they had gotten a call from a family, from a parent who the family had lost a loved one from COVID-19. And they were standing in their living room because that's where they had kind of set up shop for themselves for school, because we were, again, the beginning of a pandemic. Many of us we were virtual, many of us didn't have offices. So they were in their living room when they got this call, and they did all the things that we want helpers to do. They were empathetic, they listened, they just stayed kind of present on the phone with that parent as as they were sharing this information. But the teacher then went and got off the phone like you would and went about their daily experience. And for weeks after that phone call, every time they walked into their living room, the thought of that story came back,
Yeah.
which is a perfect example of secondary traumatic stress,
Yep.
right? It wasn't their experience. They, in fact, had not lost a loved one, but they had listened to the story of someone who was grieving a loved one from COVID-19.
Yep.
And then their brain connected the space that they heard that story with
The emotion. Yep.
the emotion. And so
Mhm.
every single time they walked into their living room,
Yep.
they were kind of presented with that thought. And so there we can see very quickly how this kind of takes a toll, because now when you're trying to relax in your living room after a really long day, or you're walking through to get to your kitchen or whatever it is, that instant kind of thought that felt so out of their control, they felt like they
Right.
couldn't manage that thought continued to come up every time they went through their living room.
That's a great example, Kayla. It really is.
So these are really, really similar, and I'm hopeful that people can kind of see it. It's not as bright as I would like it to be, but these are really similar to the trauma exposure response that we see for children and families. And this is the exposure to helpers, that secondary kind of response. So again, we see very similar symptomology. So feeling helpless or hopeless. What we know from child welfare workers, from teachers, from other helpers is that over time they can begin to see the world as not a safe place. They can begin to have less hope for the world. They can begin to feel like other people are out to get them or their children or their families, feeling unsafe in their homes or their communities as a response of hearing the stories of trauma victims. We can see them feeling like they're not good enough. They are feeling professionally potentially isolated. They are feeling less competence in their job. And this is actually kind of counterintuitive because the longer people are in the field, the more experience they do have, the more competent they are, right? And in fact, over time, we can see the exact opposite, that they feel less and less competent to do their jobs. We can see things like diminished creativity, feelings of depression, or feeling that there's lack of pleasure, really not feeling fulfilled necessarily by the work, or feeling like they're not good enough for the work, or holding stories of families just like that teacher that I told you about earlier throughout the course of your day. We can also see them, feeling extreme feelings of guilt. And this can be guilt for not responding to something in a way that they felt like they really wanted to. It can be guilt that they're feeling detached from their own family or from their students. So this feeling of not being good enough. And that really kind of flows into their personal life along with their work life. Because these symptoms don't just stay in our work life because we've been exposed to trauma in our work life. They really do kind of ripple out and impact kind of our sense of being. And in really difficult situations, we can see heightened addictions, or kind of substance use behavior, problems with gambling or shopping or other things that are kind of trying to kind of in a maladaptive way cope with what that helper is going through.
And if you think, Kayla, within the context of what we've all collectively been experiencing for the last, I can't believe it's been over, 2 years now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, this really has tested all of us. The impact of the pandemic, especially on frontline workers and teachers and educators and, those considered essential, we're going to be learning about this impact, I think, for years to come. But it really has been a collective trauma, right? And when you think about COVID-19, it's a pandemic, right? So the threat to life, if you think back to that definition of trauma that we shared, an event that, someone experiences as life-threatening, think about COVID-19, right? What we're seeing is it's challenging all of our belief about the world being a safe place, right? And I think that one of the things that is coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic is people having a greater understanding of mental health and perhaps secondary traumatic stress and trauma itself, because we're all collectively experiencing this. But and this is not just for students, this is for all of us, right? So that sense that our lives are threatened. And for those of us and those of you that have had to earlier in the pandemic return to work or always be showing up to work, with the knowledge that there's a pandemic out there that could be potentially life-threatening, that is a real source of stress and potentially traumatic. What we've seen with COVID-19 is the need for things like mental health treatment or basic needs has increased, right? That's what happens when a pandemic or an epidemic occurs. The need for certain resources skyrockets, right? So we see this increased competition for resources. So I know here in Rhode Island, we've really experienced a surge in students needing mental health treatment and having a hard time keeping up with that because the capacity, right? So the need outweighs the capacity, and that can be stressful for organizations and educators and schools. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has put us all in a position where we've had to jump into roles in our professional as well as personal lives that perhaps we weren't prepared to do, right? So now you might be doing a COVID screening, or maybe you got a quick training about how to administer a rapid COVID test. And that's not what you signed up for, right? As a teacher or as a social worker or as a helper. So lack of training for this new role of how we are supposed to help and respond to students in the face of a pandemic, right? We're seeing that many are feeling powerless, not only in their personal lives, but also professionally because of the pandemic. It really has taken on, it's a constant in all of our lives. And while things are getting better, for 2 years, we've had this feeling of powerlessness on many levels because of the pandemic and the threat that it's caused for all of us. And that, I would say, is an ongoing a stress for all of us. The uncertainty about the outcome of COVID-19, right? I think back 2 years ago, when we all thought maybe we'd just be home for 2 weeks, right? And that proved to be a very, very different. Here we are, things are getting better, but we're still dealing with this pandemic. So uncertainty can increase stress, right? Having to make important decisions in times of great distress. So you've all been showing up to work in the midst of this pandemic, and not only having to make important decisions professionally in the classroom, on behalf of your schools, on behalf of your students, but you've also probably been having to make important decisions in your personal life as well. So it's as if there's been kind of no escape from the stress of this pandemic. And all of us have had to have changes in roles and boundaries, which adds additional stress. And oftentimes, when you're not feeling completely confident in a role, right, that can lead to additional stress and us feeling like we are less prepared to deal with the task at hand. So we can't really discount the stress that we've all been going through for the last 2 years, and the adverse impacts it's been having on not only our students, right, and those children and youth that we work with, but on ourselves as well as our colleagues. which is why I think this topic is so important for us to be talking about right now. And Kayla's going to kind of talk about how it really has been this roller coaster and this feeling of there's just kind of you're out of control, right?
Yeah, and I think especially for schools that were already experiencing stress
before.
right? And I don't know if I've ever talked to a school who has not been experiencing stress prior to the pandemic. So there were so many competing agendas, so many kind of needs of the community, of your staff before COVID. And so you're adding stress to already stressed individuals, already stressed systems, and then that rapid kind of change to a different way of being where we in new roles that didn't have infrastructure in place for them. And even though we might be in schools for the most part back in person, we now are facing another stressor, which is that our workforce is kind of continuously not staffed, right? So whether it's that there's too many, staff members that are COVID positive, so they're home, or you haven't been able to hire because people are saying, I don't want to be in a school right now and expose myself to COVID, or you had people retire early, or any of these kind of unforeseen kind of things, the infrastructure is no longer there. So you're now trying to provide a job that's already more stressful and more complicated than it was before, with less resources than we had 2.5 years ago, where we know that people were already saying there's not enough resources as it is in education before the pandemic. So that does lead to this feeling of kind of burnout and fatigue, or feeling like I don't know what to do. I want to give my staff mental health days because I think that that's really important and they are under extreme amount of stress, and yet I can't approve anyone's time off, even if they have it in the bank, because we're not going to have enough staff to kind of structure the school day.
And Kayla, when you pair that with children and families and youth, their needs have skyrocketed, right? So that almost kind of demands our schools and our helpers, right, to kind of meet that demand, right, on an already taxed system dealing with all this COVID stress. It really, is almost impossible to really meet that demand.
Yeah. And in that way, we are seeing the layering, right, of stress that, over time, stress on top of stress on top of stress that's chronic, which means when we're under that much stress, our bodies are producing more cortisol and adrenaline. We are just over time going to see that become toxic on the body. And that can show in those symptoms we were talking about earlier. It can show in always feeling sick, feeling fatigued, really not feeling like we can do the things that we once were able to. And then you're seeing that really collectively in your schools and in your communities. So it's this real layering individually, and then it's 300 people that have that layered on. And then how does that, and we're going to talk about this really next, like how does that impact, in fact, the actual organizational structure? Because organization is a breathing being, right? It really grows over time. It has its own beliefs. There are like the organization is more than just the one of us, right? It's a collective. And so if we're all collectively experiencing stress, we're going to see that have a significant impact on the culture and the community. And so we'll go into a little bit of the roller coaster. This might look really familiar in some ways to all of you, because we really have we can see, if we look back on COVID, where some of these experiences were happening, or we can think about the times that we were experiencing each of these kind of experiences. So pre-disaster was like the end of February, when we started hearing that COVID might be, in the US, but we hadn't seen it maybe yet in our I think there's so many experiences when we look back that we were hearing little bits about it, but we don't have to worry about that. Or my favorite was when the CDC was recommending that we don't wear masks, right? Like that was in this pre-disaster period. And we look back and we think, oh, that was an interesting thing to be saying at the time as we look back now. But we could see things kind of ramping up. But again, like Sarah was saying, we were thinking this was going to be over really quickly, or we were thinking that's happening to those people in another community, in another country. It's not happening to us, right? So we can see that there was a warning. We were beginning to feel threatened, but we really hadn't, seen that impact yet. Then we saw, for many of our communities, it started in March. We started seeing numbers coming in, and we began to see the impact. And that's when we began to make rapid change, right? That was the week, and every community was a little bit different, but the week that teachers were and students were in school on Friday, and they were not in school on Monday, right? So we began to see this kind of rapid impact, and then what are we going to do about it? And in the midst of that, we see that the emotions go really up, right? Because we, in pre-disaster, we were saying, okay, there's some warning, but we might have been ignoring it or feeling like it's not going to happen to us. So we were a little avoidant. Now we're hitting the impact, and now we're seeing that emotional experience go really high. In the first few months after the impact, we were seeing what we now can kind of understand as like community cohesion. We were writing signs. We were saying hi to our neighbors who we never said hi to before, even though we lived in the same place, right? We were writing to seniors in homes, right? We were seeing every corporation was creating a thing about community cohesion. We would see it all over the television, right? All of these advertisements about we're stronger together. And so in that, we were seeing kind of heroic acts of essential employees. We were really in support of one another, and we were kind of coming together. That, in fact, only can happen, and this is not just the roller coaster for COVID. This happens when we have really big community events or community traumas, when we see, things like war. We see kind of other experiences that are happening to a large group of people. But we get into that kind of honeymoon phase, and then we slowly move into disillusionment, where we're seeing kind of the impact on our communities begin to dissolve. And so this is where we were seeing a lot of kind of fighting for things, right? We were seeing kind of this inability to communicate, and kind of the politicization of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we can see, and we'll continue to see, things like anniversary reaction. And that will be different for everyone. There's going to be the reaction in the community of the anniversary of maybe the time that the school, went virtual. But there's also going to be triggering anniversaries for people who have lost jobs, have lost family members, have lost housing, right? These triggers that might be coming up throughout disillusionment. And we are now in this idea of reconstruction. So this idea of new beginnings, and we're going to see setbacks throughout that process, where we might in fact feel like we're at the beginning of the roller coaster all over again. But what we can see in this is that we're hitting a lot of emotional highs and lows throughout this process, and that what is consistent is a significant amount of stress and uncertainty that has been happening for 2 years. And we can't discount that is going to have a long-term impact on all of our mental health and our functioning and our beliefs about ourselves in the world. And we are seeing that people are experiencing higher rates of depression, higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than prior to the beginning of the pandemic. So we are beginning to over and over again see this rise in mental health conditions as as we're seeing the length of time of COVID continue. And that's very true for youth, where we're seeing a huge mental health crisis, suicide crises, all of these kind of experiences for youth that are really scary. And we're seeing that again for our adults as well.
And Kayla, Amy wrote in the chat that she wonders if the pandemic-related trauma in the workplace is contributing to the Great Resignation. And, you know, I would say probably. That's a really good point, Amy. You know, and especially for those professions, like helping professions who might have felt burnt out prior to COVID, right? And not working under the best conditions, it really can be a tipping point.
Yeah, and I mean, so many of us have taken on more responsibility for the same pay, right? So, and especially, I mean, it was true before, but I think it was, especially if you were in a profession where you had to do face-to-face interaction. So educators and many of our community partners, there was an end to your day. There was only so many face-to-faces you could do. Right. And maybe this was, you know, I think in corporate America, we were seeing this kind of a long time before COVID, where it was the 24/7 access to you, to your email, the inability to stop the workday. So now, when at the beginning, when teachers were at home, I'm sure it's still happening for them, they were working until 10 o'clock at night, doing lessons plans or being available to students and parents, or feeling like they couldn't shut off work. And I think that continues for much of our culture, which then leads to this feeling of you know, I don't have a life outside of work. And so, you know, at what point do I not feel satisfied to continue? And we see resignations, or we see people looking for, you know, to be, you know, appreciated in some way, or given more, you know, money for what they're doing, because now there's no boundary on the workday.
So we know that this is causing a big impact on the education system. And just as COVID, as Kayla had said, because of COVID, we're seeing this increase in mental health issues in students. So that's really taxing our school systems, along with what educators are going through themselves. So, you know, there's been some early research and surveys kind of done within the context of COVID-19. The RAND Corporation conducted a study of educators and found that a quarter of teachers' surveys reported they were likely to leave the profession by the end of the 2020, I think, that school year. And, you know, another study or survey by the National Association of Elementary School Principals said that nearly 70% of school principals who participated in a survey conducted in early 2021 said they could not currently meet their students' mental health needs with the staff that they currently have. 84% of teachers surveyed in March 2021 reported that teaching is much more stressful than it was pre-pandemic, right? Seems obvious, but it's pretty impactful. We know that we're seeing a spike in chronic absenteeism. You know, when many schools were virtual, it was really hard for students to engage in that way, but even ongoing now, returning back in person, we're seeing increased absenteeism because of COVID itself, or kids having, you know, symptoms that might be COVID related. You know, also in a survey in March 2021, 50% of educators and school staff reported that they are burnt out. 54%, and it's probably even higher than that. So that they're experiencing high levels of fatigue and burnout, and 64% reported substantial anxiety at the workplace. So back to Amy's point, if this could be related to the Great Resignation, you know, I think yes, for sure, because, you know, working in a school is rewarding and hard enough pre-pandemic, but if you add all this on top of it, you can see the proof here in these surveys that it's really impacting our staff and our schools.
And I think a huge part of secondary traumatic stress is that it's balanced often and mitigated by compassion satisfaction. So feeling satisfied by our work, finding meaning in helping people, feeling like you're helping people. So there's a sense of meaning and purpose, and that really balances some of the symptoms that we're talking about. But when something major like COVID happens in our communities, it really can impact that feeling of compassion satisfaction, because the roles change, because of what we're doing, because it's harder, because there's less resources. It, you know, the more stressed we are, the less likely we are to feel like to feel satisfied with the work we're doing.
Right.
Right, which then begins to make it so that we're seeing even more symptoms of secondary traumatic stress.
For sure.
So how would you know if your organization is experiencing something collective in terms of secondary traumatic stress? Some of the things that we see, and again, just like every person is individualized in terms of the symptoms that are present in those for them, we also see that for organizations. So every organization is going to look a little bit different. But one of the experiences is that the community culture has changed. So there's low morale among your staff. This experience of feeling like there's, the culture is one of blame and shame or punishment, instead of kind of acknowledging and being compassionate towards one another. We can also see frequent absenteeism, and this comes because secondary traumatic stress not only impacts our mental health, it impacts our physical health. And so we can see that, when we are experiencing toxic stress because of the cortisol and adrenaline, it impacts the gut, it impacts our immune system, so we're more likely to get sick. And we get sick more often, and so we would then see this frequency in absenteeism. You also see kind of that frequency in feeling really overwhelmed, needing potentially more mental health days, feeling like I can't get out of bed, right? Because we'll see increases in things like depression. We also see that there is just kind of a dissatisfaction with the job that is part of the culture of the organization. It's not individual. So we might have people that feel dissatisfied, but overall there's a culture of dissatisfaction. We also see things like, I was working with a school one time, and Sarah knows this, where they were experiencing a lot of community violence and violence during the school day. And those teachers were exposed to a lot of violence. They were often breaking up fights, but even if they weren't, they were witnessing the violence. They were constantly on high alert because the violence was happening so frequently, and felt like it was, it was always like one step away. The kind of tension was really high. And so they stopped doing things like the teachers stopped volunteering to help with after school activities, right? It became just about the school day. There was nothing else that the school was able to provide. At that point that I was working with them, there were very few after school activities at all that were happening above and beyond the school day. Because what we know is that teachers are often the ones that are volunteering their time to do that. And so if teachers are so stressed and so scared and they are just getting through the school day, then it's less likely that they are going to commit and volunteer their time for kind of additional things above and beyond their role. But we know it's kind of like it's cyclical, it's a catch-22 a little bit. The less after school activities we have, the more violence we have, right? So we were just seeing this kind of event, that the trauma that this community was experiencing was so devastating that they could not do anything but kind of react to the situations as they were coming, and they were on real high alert. And so we saw things like lack of teamwork. You can see things like workplace bullying or bullying of students, really kind of no kind of structure for discipline, but really potentially high rates of discipline, or teachers that are sending kids to administration very frequently for discipline. So not having as much of a bandwidth to kind of manage that in the classroom, which then overwhelms the administrators, which leads to kind of, more discipline and maybe less conversation or using kind of tactics that might help with collaborative problem solving. We also, sorry, Sarah.
I was just going to say, Yvette's saying in the chat that she's seeing that in Chester, and the loss of support and participation of staff is really negatively impacting their grant funded programs, right? So any initiative, right? So let's create a trauma-informed school. Any extra initiative that you bring, right? Staff are probably less likely to embrace that or engage in it, for sure.
Yeah, and we're less creative, we're less open to change when we're experiencing that level of stress, right? Because we don't like change when as humans, we don't like change in general. We especially don't like it when we're stressed, when we're just trying to get through. So it can have a huge impact on new initiatives. And one of the big things that I've learned in the process of working with schools is if we're not addressing the staff issues and the workforce issues either concurrently or before we're trying to address kind of the trauma-informed practices for students, we often can't get out of the kind of we can't get kind of out of our own way to actually make those practices happen. So a huge part of it is doing that needs assessment of your staff and saying, okay, if in Chester we are so, you know, the workforce is so burnt out, then it might be that in your plan for trauma-informed kind of practices is that your focus is on the workforce first and trying to make sure that your workforce is supported, so then you can move on with your other initiatives.
So what can schools do? And I think the important thing here is the onus can't just be on the individual, right, teacher, educator, staff person to take care of themselves, right? It's not just about, oh, get enough sleep, go get a massage, you know. Organizations and schools really have to take ownership of this, right? So you have to, rather than avoiding, right, all this, because we know it's real, schools have to learn how to manage it. Right. So there has to be a way to kind of identify when staff and teachers are feeling burnt out or experiencing secondary traumatic stress so that intervention can happen. Right. And interventions should happen at a number of levels, not just, like I said, it's the individual's responsibility. It has to happen all throughout the school. So schools can do things like provide regular team meetings, offer professional development opportunities that are impactful and meaningful to the staff. That's really important. You know, making sure expectations, staff know their roles and that expectations are clear for staff, because that can contribute when staff don't know what their role is. You know, they might not have that satisfaction or feel confident in their role, which can lead to increased stress. Having peer support teams or networks or opportunities can be really, really impactful. Kayla facilitated, I don't even know how many, the spring of the pandemic for a school kind of peer support groups that were highly attended. I think we were surprised at how many teachers showed up after school at night for these peer support groups. It was really impactful. That can help to reduce professional isolation, right? So it's really important that you all have the opportunity to connect with each other, to hear and normalize the stress that's happening, but to also be productive about that and to be able to connect with other people. It's also really important for disciplines like social workers or psychologists, or those disciplines that in schools, they might be the only one, that they have the opportunity to connect with others who are doing a similar job in other schools. It's really important. Schools can talk about secondary traumatic stress as well as burnout, because that helps to reduce the stigma and helps us to kind of normalize that this can come with the territory. And I do think that COVID has contributed to us kind of all talking more about mental health and wellness in a way that is less stigmatizing, because we're kind of all going through this together. Schools they must provide supports and benefits that can help staff when they're struggling. So employee assistance programs, you know, things, not just prevention activities, but intervention activities. Some schools have co-located mental health professionals, not just for students, but for teachers as well. Having plans for critical incident and debriefings. So sometimes in schools, especially schools we work with that experience a high level of community violence, let's say, as an example, you know, that can kind of be normalized and just part of the day-to-day. And schools forget that, you know, that those things have an impact. So having a mechanism to debrief after a critical incident or a traumatic event can be really, really helpful for staff. And I think one of the biggest things that we want you all to walk away with is that schools don't have to face this alone. You know, there are community organizations that you can partner with to help increase access to supports, not just for your student bodies, but also for your staff. So that really can be a big tool to help combat secondary traumatic stress, is partnering with community agencies, which in the midst of a stressful environment can just seem like, you know, another thing and more work and hard to achieve, but it really can pay off in the long run if it's done intentionally.
And I found at the for schools that are beginning to kind of do maybe team meetings or debriefs, or are providing kind of space to talk about secondary traumatic stress, it's often beneficial for administrator not to be in the room. So
Yep.
I've done it where I've, as an outside community partner, have facilitated those conversations. I've also encouraged organizations to just have peer space where administrators or supervisors are not in the room where those conversations are happening, because one of the things that I think can often happen is this feeling on the part of the administrator to say either they're just complaining, or you know, I've heard that a lot, like these spaces are just used for people to complain and it doesn't make change, or they feel responsible for taking this on all on their own. So I have to fix all of these problems. Some of these things are not fixable. They're outside of your control as an administrator.
Right.
But in and of itself, being able to talk about these things can be really, really helpful for staff, even if the outcome isn't that we have a whole new thing that's going to fix it, or we figured out a way to solve the problem, right? Well, it's sharing the problem. It's the old kind of sharing the problem cuts the problem in half, right? If we're able to find other people are experiencing this with us, it does help to kind of reduce the so again, I think that we can find ways to do that, but I really encourage administrators to think about how you might be able to create spaces where you are providing both information and then maybe some opportunity for people to connect one-on-one, staff member to staff member.
For sure.
So one of the things around, you know, we want to talk briefly about building resilience, and then we want to get into, so I'll keep this really short, into kind of partnering, is that it takes time. And you'll learn that like partnering also takes time, but building resilience takes time. But I think if we're, you know, when you're thinking about how I might be able to start this in my school or my community, one of the things is having kind of realistic expectations about ourselves and about others. So it might be looking at and reevaluating what the expectations are, and are those universal? I'm working in a district right now that one expectation at one school from a principal is so very different than the expectation to the next principal. And so we're seeing kind of a breakdown in communication, and that can be really, really challenging in an organization. It can be from supervisor to supervisor, program to program, school to school, but making sure that we're having realistic expectations, and that if you are in a leadership position, you're also modeling realistic expectations. We also need to help people understand what their role is so that they can put in healthy boundaries. And Sarah, did you have something to say?
Well, I was just going to say, Kayla, this is a big one that I think is often implied, and people just take this for granted. But sometimes people aren't clear on what their role is, and that really can lead to a lot of stress, right? Or there's a mismatch. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and a lot of these policies and procedures have come before any of you were in your positions, right? So one of the things that we've done a lot with schools is really intentionally looking at those policies and procedures, both for staff and for students. Does it make sense? Do these, are these outdated? What do we want to be happening, right? And do these make sense for what we want for our school community? Oftentimes, there is a huge change in policies and procedures when we're moving towards a trauma responsive school system, because much of that is outdated. And it's things that once they're in place, we don't think about kind of going back to them. We also want to make sure that the staff culture is one, like Sarah was talking about before, where it is a place where people feel like they can speak to one another, they're connected, that the students feel connected to the school, and so do the staff. and that it's a healthy culture. And that can come from many different practices that Sarah was talking about earlier, but it is something that we must focus on, is that staff, kind of overall staff culture. And that is usually the most challenging, because just like those policies and procedures were there before you, that culture was there before many of the staff were part of it. And then ultimately we do need to be doing self-care, but as Sarah was saying earlier, self-care alone isn't going to kind of be the end all be all. The systems themselves need to be looking at roles, expectations, policies and procedures, how we model boundary setting, what we're modeling for staff, and ultimately giving them an opportunity for transparency and to be part of the process, and making sure that that's an ever-changing process.
So Kayla, James is asking, are there good examples of trauma responsive policies or procedures your schools have put in place to support both students and teachers?
Yeah, so
Yes.
I don't know. Yeah, sorry, I don't know. One of the, and I can find it and send it out. One of the schools, a school in Walla Walla, Washington, which is actually, maybe some of you have seen it, was part of the Paper Tigers documentary. In fact, had posted at one point in time their policies and procedures. And so I was working with a school here that in fact was using that and trying to mirror that, or looking back on their policies and finding that some of their policies were really outdated or racist, or were finding that they weren't creating the culture that they were looking for in their schools or for their staff. But again, I think it's really small things that we can begin to kind of look at that might be creating.
Yeah.
Yes,
And one example could be, for example, rather than out of school suspension, right? So changing that to having it be in school suspension, and having that in school suspension be more of a productive, nurturing experience, restorative experience for that student, rather than, having them be, you could look at an out of school suspension as, you've done something so horrible, you can't even be in this building, right? So reframing that to, you've done something serious, we want to help you so this doesn't happen again, right? So that's kind of more of a trauma responsive response to, rather than having an out of school suspension and having that rejection. Or, Kayla, one real simple, I guess it's not so simple, but example would be, Kayla, you work with that school here in Rhode Island where this might seem like a simple thing, but the schedule was so that students had so little time to switch classes between classes, that it was such a stressful experience. I mean, changing classes is stressful anyway in a high school, right? The noise, the crowds. But it was such a stressful experience that students were late all the time. Teachers were giving, discipline names for being late, and right. It was just a heightened level of stress. So the school altered the schedule to give a little bit more time in between classes. And that kind of brought things down a little bit, right?
Yeah, and I do think it's going to be different for each school.
Right.
And there are resources from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that are linked at the end of this presentation that we'll send to you, that really go through some of those practices to be looking at your policies and procedures. Yep. But oftentimes it is, in fact, like the environmental kind of considerations that need to come first. That school was a perfect example. It felt like chaos for each teacher, and they had many other things. They had an issue with the kids couldn't bring their backpacks and their jackets into the classroom, but they only had 5 minutes to get from one side of the high school to the other, so they needed backpacks because they couldn't stop at their locker in time. But then the students would come in. There was a no tolerance policy, which is one of the things that's huge in trauma-informed schools, is not having no tolerance policies, but they would then be sent back out. And what is that saying to that student? That student got there and they're saying, turn around, you're not welcome in this classroom. And they were often met with yelling, or teachers that were really frustrated, mainly because they didn't like the policy and they didn't feel like it really made a difference whether the kids had backpacks or not. So there was all of these kind of pieces that we're really building to make a culture that was really, really challenging for both students and teachers.
And I think one of the things we hear a lot when we train about trauma responsive and trauma informed school practices, not from everyone, but we almost always will hear at least one time, this trauma lens stuff, so does trauma now just become an excuse for students to get away with stuff, right? We sometimes hear that when we are doing these trainings, and it's really important for us to approach a trauma informed or responsive school system with this balance, right, between having an empathetic, nurturing, encouraging attitude, right, and policies and procedures to help mitigate the impact of trauma for our students and to help them navigate life, right, which includes school. You can do that in a trauma-informed and responsive way while also holding students still accountable, right, to there's the curriculum, standards of learning, their homework, their behavior, and their choices. So it's possible to do that. But in order to do that, we need to take care of our teachers, right? We need to be able to do that so they're at their best, so that they can be responsive and have that balance. And like Kayla said, that's different. That looks different for each school when you get down to the nitty-gritty policies and procedures, but many schools start with looking at their discipline procedures around kind of trauma-informed and being trauma responsive.
Mm-hmm.
You can still have discipline procedures in a trauma-informed school. They might just look a little different because the idea is shifting from what's wrong with that student to, I wonder what's happened in that student's life or what's happening now that is causing them to behave or show up this way to school today. That's the shift that we really want to happen. It's that lens that really can help have a more trauma-informed view and then can influence your policies and procedures and how you approach things like discipline.
Yeah, and I do think it comes from the staff. I was working with another district, not the one that changed their schedule, but that was looking at tardiness, and they were reprimanding for tardiness. If you had a certain number, you had to stay after school, and you got disciplined. So at some point, the students, especially in the high school, if they were going to be late, just didn't come to school because they actually got no disciplinary action when they didn't show up and they were absent. Right, but they did when they were tardy. And what does that say? It says, don't come to school. We don't want you here if you're going to be late, right? When in fact, if they were, even a half hour late, they still showed up for the other, several hours of school. So I think it is those, and that came from a teacher. There was a teacher that kept saying, the loudest person in the room, that was like, this doesn't make sense. Why are we turning kids away when they're tardy, but we're giving no disciplinary impact when they're absent? So what does that say to students? And what does that create? And so they in fact saw a huge reduction in tardiness because they still could have captured the data. They just didn't have any disciplinary action. But they saw a huge reduction in tardiness overall and absenteeism when they took away the policy of disciplinary action around tardiness.
Yeah. So, James, I don't know if you want us to move into questions now, or if you want us to talk about the importance of partnership. It's really up to, what do you think?
Yeah, I think let's talk a little bit about the community hub, and I think the partnership is fine. I think we can skip that and make sure we do have time for questions.
Sure.
So maybe just talk a little bit about the community hub model, and I think kind of building off of the Handle with Care program, like what are the opportunities for community-based partners that are working in the clinical or behavioral health department to collaborate with schools so that it's not just a school issue, it's a community-wide issue.
Community issue. Yeah,
so community hubs is a model that is being taken, and we're seeing it become more and more prevalent in our communities, that we are using the school as kind of a hub, because when you think about where families are connected, they're connected to the schools more than they are to their primary care providers, more than they are to their mental health clinics, more than they are to their employment counseling. So we've seen schools really take an approach that they're open on Saturdays and they have food pantries, they're providing support to, families throughout, the course of the week, or they have kind of opportunities to provide support to parents as well as students about kind of education and career counseling. We've seen a lot of schools move towards kind of intergenerational kind of connection where they are partnering with senior centers to create kind of opportunities for intergenerational connection and meaning making. So there are so many opportunities. And one thing that I think can be challenging is funding, but I think we can be really, really creative about funding. So one thing that in our organization is we partner with the district that our site is in, and we have mental health therapists co-located in schools to provide outpatient treatment during the school day. And in fact, that doesn't cost the school much because we're able to bill third party. So we bill that child's insurance or that family's insurance for those sessions. And so the school is not trying to, come up with a ton of money to have these providers there. And it's not grant funded where it might go away. So the school has a small fund for kids that are uninsured or underinsured, but above and beyond that, it's really being kind of self-funded through third party billing. And I've seen similar things with other programs like primary care as well, where they have a clinic on site. And again, we're billing the insurance, and maybe we have a small fund that we've gone out for a grant for that allows for us to provide support when it's not funded by a child's insurance. But it allows kids to get access to preventative health care. It can allow families, so parents, to get access in their communities, because we often live fairly close to the schools that we're in, to health care as well as to mental health care. And that can be made available to staff as well.
And is there sort of like a handoff, towards the end of the school year? Because one of the things I frequently hear, and I think the data also backs it up, is that there's often increases of violence both at the beginning of the school year, but also at the end of the school year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like this change.
Oh yeah, huge changes coming, right? So
the leading school.
Yeah.
So how do you, in the schools that you're in, how do you work with the schools to try to address those significant changes for the students? And I guess for the teachers as well.
Yeah, so in the schools that we're in, we don't provide mental health for the teachers. We've actually put out proposals for that, but we do provide it to the students and families. And our staff actually work a full year. They do not work a school year. So those students, in fact, still are clients of ours, and they still have access to treatment throughout the summer. So we're not seeing kind of an issue with that, where we would then go out to their homes or they would come into our clinic. And we might see a reduction in how many sessions we do with them, right? We might go to biweekly or something to make it available and supportive for the family so that they stay engaged. But we were really intentional about saying we want to make sure that mental health professionals are available. The same mental health professionals are available during the summer to those families as well. And we are a social service agency, so we also offer, supports above and beyond counseling that then those families are connected to.
I think one of the biggest things too for me, James, is, there are resources out there in every community to help with things like mental health distress, basic needs, right? And often I think what happens is schools don't either know where to go, or they make a referral, then they don't know what happens, right? The more that we can kind of bring them into this hub, right? And, increase kind of communication or ease of referral or co-locate. I'm a big fan of co-location, right? The less families will fall through the cracks, right? And then that'll have a positive impact, not only on those families, but the school community as a whole. So it's not like you have to create new things. It's harnessing what's out there, but looking at it and doing it in a different, creative way that might not be traditional,
Do Do folks on the call have questions for Sarah or Kayla? Because I could ask a million more, but I want to let you all have the opportunity. All right, I'm going to jump back in then, unless anybody, last chance. The community hub model, yes, this recording will be shared, and we've recording it. We're gonna share it. The community hub model. How often? First, who participates in the community hub, and how often does it meet?
So I think it's really different for every community. So we
Right.
have one here in a very small community called Central Falls here in Rhode Island, if any of you are familiar. And they are, it is a true hub. And it was started by, the school was started by a social worker with the real intention of it always being a hub school, which is different than I think some of our public schools that are now adopting a hub model. So they kind of intentionally were kind of partnering from the beginning to have a primary care clinic on site, to have mental health support on site. And so again, they're all co-located. So they would have kind of team meetings, but it's really all there. And that hub school is open 6 days a week. So they are open on Saturdays. They have food pantry, they have clothing pantries in the school. They do have family and youth enrichment. They have many of the people in the community of Central Falls are Spanish speaking, so they do have educational supports in both English and Spanish for parents. So night classes and things are done right out of that school, as well as kind of career counseling or employment counseling. So they really, it's a small community, but partnered with their organization that was able to provide, career counseling for adults or mental health treatment for adults, because that is really different than mental health treatment for kids, right? But they had those supports in place. So for that school, they really intentionally built it to be a hub.
Right.
For other schools, I think the challenge is over time, how do we partner strategically to in fact create a hub? And one of the big things is like space. Like how do we get this, what do we do? We're running out of space here. How do we use our space really strategically? And some of the communities we've seen, there's an office and maybe it's only one day a week that the primary care person's there or the mental health therapist is there, and they share that office, right? It was like a drop-in office that they're using. So again, I think it's different for in every school community. And I think we actually link a lot more about hub schools, because I think it's a really interesting model that's being developed. But it is for staff also this opportunity, as Sarah was saying earlier, to not feel like the school is the only person giving support, which is often what we hear is like, well, now I have to be a therapist, I have to be a caseworker, I have to be all of these things. How do I do that? I was only taught to be an educator. And so I think it's again, I think it can lessen the load when we have caseworkers or case managers or community health workers or therapists or primary care providers or social services really embedded in the school system. And again, it can start with just sharing one office and each one of them co-locating one day a week.
Yeah, I wish we had Austin on the call, because I believe Austin has community health centers that they co-locate in their schools.
Yes.
So we've heard of community health centers. We've heard a little bit of the community hub model. I think Laconia also has something similar. It might not be a community health center, but it sounds like I believe they co-locate clinical staff in their schools as well. So yeah, this is really good. Does anybody else in the participants that are on the call, do you guys have anything unique like that?
Amy Holmes from Cumberland County. Some of our schools have youth school-based health services, so there's medical providers. We have a FQHC in town that has nursing staff placed in a few of our school, and it's a full clinic version.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
That's awesome. I've seen schools start with gardens, right? I think we can get back to this idea of we have I have a school that I work with that has a huge garden, and part of it is that the students have become really involved in it, and it's a beautiful thing, and they're getting their hands dirty and they're growing things, and they're learning about science. But that actually makes it so that they are able to provide fresh foods in the food pantry.
Right.
So like most food pantries, it's just pantry items, right? And in the summertime, and they're looking for a grant to get a greenhouse so they could do this year round. But in the summertime, they're able to provide fresh produce that the kids have watched and have seen grow. And so it really is this, it's also connecting back to that community. And we've seen that both in rural and urban communities where we're kind of investing in urban gardening, right? And really kind of utilizing that for kids to feel connected to their community and find meaning that they can do something that gives back. And so the community, they really feel connected to the community. And I can't see the chat, but I know the number just went up. So I don't know if there's anything else.
Oh, it's James.
That was
giving
just
the
me.
survey.
Just
Oh,
me.
okay.
Yeah.
Any
And I'll stop
last
sharing for questions. Yeah.
Yeah, any last second questions? If not, Sarah and Kayla, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will be providing the slide deck for the presentation that will have Sarah and Kayla's contact information. If you have any questions for them, please fill out our post-webinar survey that helps us get a sense of how we did, and more importantly, make sure that if you're interested in getting connected to Sarah and Kayla, we can make sure that that happens. Obviously, that is part of our TTA services. So for our CYVP sites, if you guys are interested in further conversations and training, or even just having thought conversations with Sarah and Kayla, let me know, and I'll be sure to make sure you all get connected. In the interim, thank you so much for the work that you all did. There's so much to say on this topic. This is just the beginning. We're going to be coming out with a knowledge sharing document in a few weeks that talks a little bit about EAPs. Kayla and Sarah, remind me, EAP? There's so many acronyms in my head.
Employee Assistance Program.
Employee Assistance Programs,
Yeah.
which can be super important for teachers and staff, especially during these incredibly difficult times that you all are going through right now. So stay tuned for that. And thank you all very much. And we'll talk to you again later.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.